Hey, what's up everyone? This is Mr. Drake. This is the final video of Unit 3 going over life and society in ancient India. Now, one of the most important aspects of society in ancient India, as was alluded to in some of the readings you've done and the videos you've watched on Hinduism, was the caste system. And the caste system is the social hierarchy in India. And the caste system is not limited to ancient India. It actually still persists really into modern times, where you don't see a lot of marriage between castes, for example, or people being able to move up in their situation during their lives. Now, at the very top of the caste system in ancient India was the priests, and they were at the top because they were considered to be closest to the gods. Right below the priests, you have the warriors, the kings, the rulers, known as the Kshatriyas, and then the Vaisyas were right below that. That's your middle class, like the traders, merchants, people who run shops, things like that. Then below that is probably the biggest aspect of the population, the biggest percentage, the Sudras. That's your unskilled workers, your farmers, your peasants, things like that. And then below them even was a group known as untouchables, and you often hear them referred to as pariahs, which is a word still used in modern day vocabulary for people who are outcasts and are not really part of society at all. These were people who did things like clean latrines, sweep streets, and basically had to walk in the gutter. They couldn't even walk on sidewalks or on streets. So a very, very stringent, very strict social hierarchy that was very clearly laid out in ancient India. You can see there. Now, one very important thing in Indian people's daily lives was their sense of duty. And the reason that was so important is that they believe very strongly in karma, which you heard about in the Hinduism video as being the belief that your actions have consequences, not only for other people, but for you in future incarnations of yourself. So the idea was that even though you can't move up in caste during your lifetime, if you adhere to what you're supposed to do and perform your duties well in this life, you might be reincarnated into a higher social caste in your next life. Now, there are three particularly important pillars of Indian life. The first one is the caste, which we've talked about, and how important it was to adhere to what you were supposed to do in society. Family and village or community were also incredibly important. The caste system, it's very discriminatory, as you can imagine, but it did ensure order. Everyone knew what their role was and what they were supposed to do. And the caste, like I said, they weren't equal, but they had their own leaders. The caste sort of depended on each other. For example, if you were a ruler, you still needed someone to make your clothing, for example. So even the upper classes depended on the lower classes. Now, family is very important in their society as well, and the ultimate goal was to have extended families living together under one roof within their community. So that means the parents, the grandparents, the children, aunts, uncles, everyone living together. Now, usually that didn't actually end up happening because the life expectancy in ancient times was so low. It was fairly rare for people to live out of their 30s, for example. So most families don't actually achieve having that many groups or that many generations under one roof. But that was the goal to aspire to. That typically happened in the upper classes because, as in any society, the upper classes tend to live longer. They have better access to medicine and better food and things like that. Marriages were typically arranged, which means the parents decided who was going to marry whom when the eventual married couple was very young. And it was typically based on social status. So if you came from a family of shoemakers, for example, you were probably going to marry someone from another family of shoemakers or leather makers or what have you. And brides, to this day in India actually, in many cases, paid what's called a dowry. And that is a payment to the groom or to the groom's family in exchange for his hand in marriage. Now, villages varied greatly in ancient India. Archaeologists have found villages that were just a handful of houses, and that's about it. And they've also found huge, what would be considered cities at the time, with hundreds of houses and hundreds of buildings. And the way cities were typically laid out at the time is in the center you had sort of your city center, so to speak, your homes, shops, government buildings, and things like that. And then sort of around the center, on the outside, you would find farms. Villages were typically self-sufficient, and that means they made everything they needed. Some villages did trade for certain things depending on their specialties of their residents, but generally all the food a village needed would be grown by people within that village on their own farms, for example. As far as the role of women in villages, men and women often worked together to govern villages. There are records from the Gupta Empire of women serving on town councils, for example. But as Hinduism became more entrenched in Indian society, the role of women actually began to diminish, and men became much more dominant at that point. So now we've learned a little bit about Indian society and daily life. Here's what you need to do now. Finish your choice activities for Unit 3. And remember, for Unit 3, it's going to be significantly easier than Unit 2. It consists only of an article or video summary, which you can type in Moodle, and the project on mythical animals, the link to which you can find on the blog. Both of those things are due on test day, which in this case is Monday, September the 10th. Also, speaking of the test, be looking over your information for that. It's going to primarily be on India, but there will be some information on Mesopotamia and Egypt that you'll be responsible for as well. Mrs. Hall or myself will give you more detailed information on what to study in class as the test gets closer. Thanks for listening, and as always, ask your teachers if you have any questions.